chosen one. There is a moment in personal growth when you suddenly realize something has changed in your social world. The number of people around you quietly becomes smaller. Invitations appear less often. Conversations that once filled your phone throughout the day begin fading. The noise that used to surround your life gradually turns into silence. At first, this shift can feel confusing. You might wonder whether something went wrong, whether you became too distant, or whether people simply lost interest. But the deeper truth is often much simpler and far less negative than it first appears. As you mature, your tolerance for misalignment naturally decreases. The things you once ignored or laughed off begin standing out more clearly. Patterns of drama feel heavier. Disrespect that once seemed minor becomes impossible to overlook. Inconsistency that you previously excused starts revealing deeper problems in the foundation of certain relationships. Maturity changes the lens through which you see people, and once that lens becomes clearer, the social environment around you begins adjusting automatically. When you were younger or earlier in your journey, social connection often revolved around availability and shared habits rather than true alignment. Being present, being easygoing, and being willing to participate in whatever the group was doing created connection quickly. There were more gatherings, more spontaneous plans, more casual interactions that did not require much thought. But many of those connections were built on convenience rather than depth. They survived because everyone involved shared the same rhythm of life at that time. As maturity develops, that rhythm begins changing. Your priorities evolve. The way you spend time becomes more intentional. You start thinking about energy rather than simply filling space with activity. And when your priorities shift, the compatibility that once held certain friendships together begins weakening.
The circle shrinks, not because you are broken or antisocial, but because your standards have become clearer. Maturity introduces a quiet filter into your life. It forces you to evaluate what truly adds value to your time and emotional space. Activities that once felt normal may now feel draining. Endless gossip that once felt like bonding starts sounding like negativity. Being around people who constantly complain about the same problems without seeking solutions begins feeling exhausting. The filter is not about judging others harshly. It is about recognizing what aligns with the direction you are moving. When you begin valuing peace, focus, and emotional stability, environments built on chaos naturally lose their appeal. The result of this shift is often misunderstood. From the outside, it may look like isolation or distance, but from the inside, it feels more like clarity. You begin recognizing that not every connection needs to remain permanent in order to have been meaningful. Some friendships served their purpose during a specific stage of life. They were built around shared experiences that no longer exist in the same form. Holding on to them out of habit can create tension because the foundation that once supported them has changed. Instead of forcing those connections to continue in the same way, maturity allows them to fade naturally. This fading can feel uncomfortable at first because humans are wired to value belonging. A smaller circle can trigger feelings of loneliness, especially if you were once surrounded by a large social group. But loneliness and clarity are not the same thing. Loneliness comes from feeling unseen or unsupported. Clarity comes from understanding that your life is moving toward a direction that requires different relationships. The difference between the two becomes clear when you examine the quality of the connections that remain. Instead of dozens of casual interactions, you begin valuing a few relationships that offer honesty, stability, and mutual respect. Conversations become deeper. Time spent together becomes more meaningful. Trust grows stronger because it is no longer spread across a wide network of superficial interactions. Maturity, therefore, shifts the definition of friendship. Instead of measuring connection by quantity, you begin measuring it by alignment. Alignment means the people around you share similar values regarding growth, responsibility, and respect.
It means they celebrate your progress rather than feeling threatened by it. It means they can challenge you honestly without undermining your confidence. Relationships built on this foundation tend to be fewer in number because genuine alignment is rarer than simple availability. But the strength of those connections compensates for the smaller circle. Another reason maturity shrinks the room is that your presence itself begins changing. When you develop clearer boundaries and stronger self-awareness, the way you interact with others evolves. You may no longer laugh at jokes that rely on putting someone else down. You may no longer stay silent when disrespect appears. You may choose to leave environments that once felt normal simply because they no longer reflect your values. These changes subtly alter the dynamic between you and the people around you. Some individuals adapt and grow alongside you. Others feel uncomfortable because your new standards highlight the patterns they are not ready to change. In those cases, distance appears naturally. They may stop inviting you to certain spaces because they sense you no longer belong there. This is not rejection in the traditional sense. It is simply the natural separation that occurs when people move in different directions. Chosen one. Maturity shrinking the room is not a sign that your life is losing connection. It is a sign that your life is gaining clarity.
As you grow, the environment around you reorganizes itself to match the direction you are moving. The crowd becomes smaller because alignment becomes more specific. And although the silence may feel unfamiliar at first, it often signals something important. Your life is beginning to center around purpose rather than popularity. Chosen one. The first real reason your circle begins shrinking as you mature is surprisingly simple. Boundaries. Boundaries quietly reorganize your relationships because they reveal who valued you and who merely valued access to you. Earlier in life, many connections form around convenience. You say yes easily, you show up often, and you adjust your time to accommodate the needs of others. In those early stages, saying yes feels natural because belonging feels important. You answer messages immediately, attend gatherings even when you feel tired, and participate in conversations that may not truly interest you. None of this feels harmful at first because the environment rewards availability. People respond positively to the person who is always present, always agreeable, always willing to join whatever activity the group proposes. But maturity introduces a new awareness. Time and emotional energy are limited resources. As responsibilities grow and personal goals become clearer, you begin realizing that constant availability comes with a hidden cost. Every hour spent in environments that drain your focus is an hour removed from building the life you want. Every conversation that revolves around negativity quietly shifts your mindset away from progress. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It builds gradually as experience accumulates. You begin noticing how certain interactions leave you energized, while others leave you mentally exhausted. Once that awareness develops, boundaries naturally follow. Boundaries are not dramatic announcements or confrontations. They are small decisions repeated consistently. You start declining invitations that conflict with your priorities. You take longer to respond to conversations that do not require urgency. You limit the amount of time spent in environments that revolve around drama, gossip, or constant complaint. These changes may seem minor from your perspective, but they significantly alter how others experience your presence. People who were accustomed to unlimited access suddenly notice that the pattern has shifted. Some accept the change without resistance because they understand that growth requires focus. Others react differently because the boundary removes something they depended on. This is when separation begins revealing the true structure of certain friendships. Some individuals were connected to you because of who you are, while others were connected because of what you provided. When the availability disappears, The second group often fades quickly. This does not necessarily mean those people disliked you. It simply means the relationship was built around a role you were playing, rather than mutual alignment. The role may have been emotional support, entertainment, or simply being the person who always agreed to join whatever the group was doing. Once that role changes, the connection loses its foundation. Maturity also shifts your relationship with peace. Earlier stages of life often reward stimulation. Busy schedules, constant messages, spontaneous plans, and lively discussions create a sense of activity that feels exciting. But as emotional awareness grows, that excitement begins to feel different. What once felt lively may now feel chaotic. Endless conversations about other people's problems or mistakes begin sounding repetitive rather than engaging. Environments where negativity dominates the atmosphere stop feeling like connection and start feeling like distraction. This is where peace becomes more valuable than entertainment. Instead of seeking activity simply to fill time, you begin choosing environments that preserve your mental clarity. Quiet evenings, focused work, or meaningful conversations with a small number of trusted people begin replacing the constant social noise that once filled your schedule. When peace becomes a priority, certain friendships naturally fade because they were built around shared chaos rather than shared growth. Mature people rarely bond through negativity. While temporary venting is normal in any relationship, constant complaint rarely produces meaningful connection. People who bond primarily through criticism of others or through repeated discussion of problems without solutions eventually create emotional environments that feel heavy rather than supportive. As maturity develops, you begin recognizing that true connection does not require constant drama to sustain it. Stability, respect, and honesty become far more valuable than excitement created by conflict. This realization reduces the number of environments where you feel comfortable spending time. The final shift that accelerates the shrinking circle is the gradual end of people-pleasing. Earlier in life, many individuals maintain relationships by managing other people's expectations carefully. They explain themselves repeatedly to avoid disappointing others. They offer help even when their own energy is low. They apologize for setting limits or expressing different opinions. This pattern often begins with good intentions because kindness and cooperation are valuable qualities. But when people-pleasing becomes habitual, it creates relationships based on obligation rather than authenticity. Maturity disrupts that pattern because self-respect grows stronger over time. You begin understanding that honesty sometimes leads to disappointment, and that disappointment is not necessarily harmful. Allowing someone to feel upset does not mean you are unkind. It simply means you are no longer sacrificing your own well-being to maintain comfort for everyone else. When you stop over-explaining your choices and stop overcompensating for every difference in opinion, the dynamic of certain friendships changes dramatically. People who respected you for your character remain present because they appreciate authenticity. But individuals who depended on your constant accommodation often feel uncomfortable when the pattern changes. They may interpret the shift as distance, coldness, or arrogance because they were accustomed to the earlier version of you that always adjusted to maintain harmony. Chosen one. This stage of maturity can feel lonely at times because the number of relationships built on obligation begins disappearing. But what remains is far stronger. Instead of friendships that depend on your availability, you begin developing connections that respect your boundaries. Instead of relationships maintained through constant agreement, you cultivate bonds that allow honesty without fear. The circle becomes smaller, not because connection disappeared, but because only the relationships built on genuine alignment continue moving forward with you. Chosen one. As maturity deepens and your life begins moving in a more intentional direction, another reason your circle naturally shrinks begins revealing itself. Growth creates contrast, and contrast makes people uncomfortable when they are not ready to grow themselves. When two people once lived at a similar pace, shared similar habits, and held similar priorities, their connection often felt effortless. There was little friction because both individuals were operating within the same expectations and rhythms. But when one person begins changing, while the other remains in the same patterns, that harmony quietly disappears. The distance that forms is not always visible at first, but it slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Your discipline begins highlighting their procrastination. Your emotional control exposes their impulsiveness. Your willingness to work toward long-term goals makes their short-term distractions stand out more clearly. None of this happens because you are trying to compete or prove something. It simply happens because growth changes the environment around you. The presence of progress creates a mirror effect in every relationship. When someone looks at you and sees a version of life that requires discipline, patience, and self-awareness, they must decide how to interpret that reflection. Some people feel inspired by it. They see your progress and become curious about what they might change in their own habits. They ask questions, adopt new routines, and gradually grow alongside you. These individuals often remain in your life because they welcome the contrast rather than resisting it. But not everyone responds this way. For some people, the contrast feels like pressure rather than inspiration. Instead of asking what they might improve in their own life, they focus on reducing the tension created by your progress. One way to do this is through labeling. They may say you have changed, that you are becoming distant, serious, or even boring. These labels are rarely meant as thoughtful observations. More often, they are attempts to explain why the connection no longer feels comfortable. When someone says you have changed, the statement is often true, but not in the negative way they imply. Growth requires change. What they are actually expressing is that your evolution disrupted the familiar version of you they were comfortable with. In earlier stages of life, shared habits often define friendships. Staying out late, spending hours in casual conversation, or participating in group activities that require little commitment creates a sense of belonging. But as your priorities evolve, those habits begin shifting. You may start waking earlier to focus on work or personal goals. You may become more intentional about health, spirituality, learning, or building something meaningful for your future. The hours once spent in random social interaction now carry different value. Time becomes something you invest rather than simply spend. This shift changes the rhythm of your relationships. Friends who once expected immediate replies or constant availability may begin noticing delays. Invitations that once felt automatic now receive thoughtful consideration. From your perspective, this is simply maturity guiding your decisions. But from their perspective, it may look like withdrawal. The difference lies in priorities. When purpose rises in someone's life, random access naturally decreases. Purpose requires energy, focus, and consistency. It demands time for reflection, planning, and work that often happens quietly behind the scenes. Maintaining those commitments means reducing the distractions that once filled empty space. This does not mean you suddenly dislike the people around you. It simply means your attention has been redirected toward building something meaningful. For individuals who share similar priorities, this change feels natural. They understand that growth requires sacrifice and discipline. But for those who remain attached to the earlier rhythm of life, your new priorities may feel like rejection. They may interpret your focus as arrogance or distance because it removes you from the environment where the friendship originally formed. In many cases, insecurity plays a role as well. When someone sees a person they once considered equal beginning to progress in ways they have not yet pursued themselves, comparison quietly appears. The mind begins measuring distance between two paths that once felt similar. If that distance continues growing, discomfort increases. Instead of confronting the comparison directly, Some individuals reduce the tension by redefining the situation. They may convince themselves that you changed in a negative way or that your priorities are unnecessary. This narrative protects their self-image because it frames your growth as the problem rather than the contrast between your paths. Chosen one. Understanding this process helps you interpret the shrinking circle with clarity rather than resentment. The friendships fading around you are not always disappearing because of conflict. Often, they are dissolving because compatibility has changed. You did not necessarily lose friends. What changed was alignment. When your life begins moving toward purpose, discipline, and intentional growth, the environment around you reorganizes itself. Some people grow alongside you and remain part of your journey. Others stay in the season where the friendship began. And as both paths continue moving in different directions, the distance between them becomes natural rather than forced. Chosen one. When your circle begins shrinking as maturity deepens, it is easy to focus only on what seems to be disappearing. Fewer invitations, fewer casual conversations, fewer people who feel familiar in the same way they once did. But growth rarely removes something without creating space for something better to form. When quantity decreases, quality often begins increasing. The empty space left behind by fading relationships becomes the ground where more aligned connections can eventually grow. This shift is not immediate, and that is where many people misunderstand the process. There is usually a period of quiet between the old circle and the new one. During that time, your life may feel unusually calm or even lonely. But this quiet stage is not a failure in your social life. It is the transition period where your environment is recalibrating around your values.
One of the biggest upgrades maturity brings to relationships is the move from performance to authenticity.
In larger social circles, many interactions operate through subtle performance. People present versions of themselves that fit the expectations of the group. Humor, opinions, and even emotional reactions often adjust to match what keeps the environment comfortable. These performances are not always dishonest. They are simply part of how large groups maintain harmony. But as your circle becomes smaller, performance becomes less necessary. In a smaller group built on trust, people do not need to impress each other constantly. Conversations become more honest, disagreements become less threatening, and vulnerability becomes easier to share. Instead of maintaining a social role, you are simply allowed to be yourself. This authenticity creates stronger foundations because it allows trust to develop over time. Another important concept maturity teaches is that not every friendship is meant to last forever. Some relationships are seasonal. They appear during a specific chapter of life and serve an important purpose for that time. There are friends who help you survive difficult periods. There are friends who share experiences with you while you are learning who you are. There are friends who walk beside you when life feels uncertain and chaotic. But when the season that created the friendship changes, the relationship sometimes fades as well. This does not mean the friendship was meaningless. It simply means it fulfilled its purpose during that chapter. Mature individuals learn how to appreciate the role someone played without forcing the connection to continue beyond its natural season. Instead of holding on to every relationship as if it must remain permanent, they learn to bless the time it existed and release it with gratitude. This perspective reduces bitterness because it recognizes that growth changes the environment for everyone involved.
As the old circle fades, new connections begin forming in different spaces.
These spaces are usually connected to the values you now prioritize. When you invest time in learning, service, faith, creativity, or disciplined work, you naturally begin encountering people who share similar commitments. Unlike earlier friendships formed through convenience, these connections develop through shared direction. People meet while working towards something meaningful, rather than simply spending time together. This shared direction becomes the foundation for deeper trust. When two people demonstrate consistency in their actions over time, their reliability becomes visible without needing constant explanation. Trust grows from observing behavior repeatedly, rather than from quick, emotional closeness. One of the most important lessons in building these new relationships is patience. Authentic friendships rarely develop quickly. Trust requires time, shared experience, and evidence of character. In the early stages, interactions may feel slower than the spontaneous connections you experienced in larger social groups. But that slower pace is often a sign of stability rather than distance. When relationships grow gradually, they have time to develop roots strong enough to support honesty and loyalty. Maturity also teaches you not to force closeness out of fear of loneliness. When someone feels isolated, the temptation to accept any available connection becomes strong. But relationships built out of desperation rarely last, because they ignore the alignment that healthy friendships require. Choosing patience protects you from returning to environments that once drained your energy simply because they were familiar. Another essential principle is refusing to tolerate disrespect in order to avoid being alone. Respect becomes one of the most valuable qualities in mature relationships.
It appears in small details. How someone speaks to you during disagreement, whether they celebrate your success without competing, whether they remain consistent when circumstances become difficult. Individuals who cannot offer these qualities may still be friendly acquaintances, but they cannot occupy the deeper spaces of your circle. Chosen one. When maturity replaces quantity with alignment, your social world becomes smaller but stronger. The crowd disappears, but the foundation beneath your relationships becomes more stable. Instead of many voices competing for your attention, a few trusted individuals remain who support your growth and challenge you honestly. And although the room feels quieter, it also becomes clearer. The relationships that survive this stage are not built on convenience or habit. They are built on shared values, mutual respect, and the patience required to grow together over time. Chosen one. By the time maturity begins reshaping your life, the shrinking circle that once felt confusing starts revealing a deeper purpose. What initially appeared to be loss slowly begins looking more like protection. The fewer people around you, the clearer your environment becomes. Noise decreases, distractions lose their grip. Emotional chaos that once followed certain relationships quietly disappears. In its place, something far more valuable begins forming. Space. Space to think clearly, space to focus on the direction of your life, and space to build the future that requires your full attention. Many people interpret a smaller circle as loneliness because they measure connection by numbers. They remember earlier seasons filled with constant activity, large friend groups, and endless communication. Compared to that noise, a quieter life can feel unfamiliar. But maturity introduces a different definition of connection. Instead of asking how many people are around you, the more important question becomes, who can actually stand with you as your life evolves?
Not everyone who shared a season of life with you is prepared to walk into the next one. Growth changes priorities, values, and expectations. When those shifts happen, certain relationships naturally fall away because they were never built to support the direction you are now moving toward. A smaller circle often protects your peace more than a large one ever could. Peace is not simply the absence of conflict. It is the presence of stability in your emotional and mental environment. When fewer voices compete for your attention, you are able to think more clearly. When you are no longer surrounded by constant opinions, expectations, or distractions, your decisions become more intentional. The silence that replaces the old noise allows you to listen more carefully to your own instincts, your values, and the direction you feel called to follow. In many ways, this quiet space becomes the training ground where discipline and clarity develop. This stage of life also forces you to confront the difference between solitude
and isolation. Isolation is usually driven by fear. It appears when someone withdraws from others because of disappointment or distrust. Solitude, however, is intentional. It is the decision to spend time alone so that your mind can reset and your focus can strengthen. Mature individuals learn how to use solitude as a tool rather than seeing it as a punishment. In solitude, your priorities sharpen. You gain time to develop skills, improve your habits, and reflect on what truly matters. The absence of constant social stimulation gives your mind room to grow. That does not mean connection disappears completely. In fact, the opposite often happens over time. When your life becomes aligned with your values, the right people begin appearing naturally. They may not arrive in large numbers, but the relationships that form tend to be stronger and more stable. These individuals respect your boundaries instead of challenging them.
They celebrate your progress instead of competing with it. Their presence adds clarity rather than confusion. Because these connections develop slowly, they carry a deeper level of trust. Chosen one. The shrinking of your circle is not evidence that your life is becoming empty. It is evidence that your life is becoming focused. What remains around you is no longer random access, but intentional alignment. Each relationship that stays in your life has passed through the quiet filter created by your maturity. And that filter protects something important: your peace, your purpose, and the future you are building with careful attention. If your circle has become smaller as you've grown, don't rush to fill the space. Sometimes the quiet season is where clarity and real alignment begin. Comment quality if you're choosing depth over noise, and subscribe for more Chosen One insights on growth, boundaries, and living with purpose.